Hey, what's going on everybody, Spectrum here, and today's video is about some surprisingly common misconceptions about ancient Rome that a lot of people seem to believe. These generally are either pieces of quote-unquote common knowledge that are either oversimplifications or statements that are simply not true. Now, I don't really blame the people that believe in these things. After all, not everybody is particularly interested, nor should they necessarily be interested, in the history of Rome, to the point they'd know certain commonly held beliefs are actually false. After all, people have their own lives, their own interests, and their own problems. They have way too much stuff going on for them to have to be completely correct about absolutely everything they come to know. Which is why, before we start with the misconceptions, this goes for the people who don't know much about Roman history but click this video because they were interested. If you're watching this video and you don't know much about ancient Rome and you want to start learning about it, then I recommend you begin with the wonderful podcast The History of Rome by Mike Duncan. The series goes from the founding myth all the way to the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and it's a legitimately great way to start your trip towards becoming a Romaboo. Now, let's get to the premise of this video. Misconception number 1 is Julius Caesar was an emperor. It's actually shocking just how common this misconception is. I've had friends, and these were cultured, well-learned, well-read friends, who genuinely thought Julius Caesar was an emperor. Ironically enough, this statement is actually technically true, in two different ways actually. There was a Roman emperor, two in fact, named Gaius Julius Caesar, but we know them as Augustus and Caligula. They're not the Julius Caesar we're thinking of. The second way this statement is technically true is the fact that Julius Caesar was acclaimed as imperator, which, as you may imagine, is the word which emperor comes from. However, this was merely a military title and did not have the autocratic connotations the word emperor has. In fact, Julius Caesar was not the first man to be given the title of imperator, as many prominent Roman politicians were similarly acclaimed as such. These were people such as Scipio, Marius, Sulla, and Pompey, all of whom preceded Caesar and were acclaimed as imperator. Now, you can make the argument that Caesar, after defeating Pompey, had so much authority that he was essentially an emperor, and to be honest, it's a pretty solid argument, especially when you consider the fact that the position of emperor wasn't really an official role, and more of a bunch of different authorities and positions granted to a single man. The closest thing to it was the title of princeps, a self-given name by Augustus, which meant something like the first citizen, and the emperor throughout most of the empire's history was referred to as such. Caesar never called himself such a thing, and besides, since there's a time gap between his assassination and Augustus's ascension into absolute power, common historical convention puts Julius Caesar firmly out of the list of Roman emperors. Common misconception number 2 is Caligula made his horse a consul. This one is particularly egregious, considering there's no actual source that actually said such a thing. This particular myth originates from Suetonius, who in his work published some 80 years after Caligula's death, The 12 Caesars, said Caligula planned, P-L-A-N-N-E-D, to make his horse a consul. Now, Suetonius already isn't exactly the most credible source regarding Caligula here, but even he never said Caligula actually made his horse a consul. I don't even need to play devil's advocate for Caligula in this one. The supposed source itself for this myth never even suggests such a thing. I think this is just one misconception formed out of exaggeration. The original story was likely already an exaggeration. Most likely it was just an offhanded remark by Caligula that implied his horse would be a better consul than the whole lot in the Senate. That ballooned into a rumor that he planned to make his horse a consul, and then Suetonius wrote it, only for the story to be ballooned even further into one that said Caligula outright made his horse a consul. The third common misconception I'll be tackling will be another regarding a particularly bad Roman emperor, and that is Nero burned down Rome. Now, there are several different stories about this, but in broad strokes, it goes: Nero either wanted to build himself a new imperial palace or wanted to burn down the city so he could either read Homer's or Virgil's verses on the fall of Troy, or wanted to play the fiddle to a burning Rome. Or all three, or a combination of them. And so he burned down the city while doing whatever he wanted. Later, when the people began accusing him of starting the fire, he shifted the blame to the Christians and started their persecution. The reality is, only the last part of this story is true. For starters, fires were surprisingly common in ancient Rome, largely due to the city's shoddy construction. And the Great Fire under Nero's reign wasn't the only major one throughout the history of Rome. Crassus used to buy property under fire for his own personal benefit. Rome had another great fire under the joint rule of Fupienus and Balbinus, and there were other countless fires which occurred throughout the city's existence. As for the ever so famous statement of Nero played the fiddle while Rome burned, it is completely false, given 1. The fiddle hadn't been invented yet, which, in the podcast series The History of Rome by Mike Duncan, gives way to the epic joke, Nero didn't play the fiddle, he played the lyre, get it? And number 2, Nero wasn't even in Rome at the time, he was in Antium. And as soon as he found out, he returned to Rome and assisted in repair and accommodation efforts. Now sure, perhaps, once the fire had been settled, his quickness to rebuild the burned neighborhoods of the city in the Greek style, as well as building a new imperial palace for himself, may have exacerbated the accusations placed upon him that he started the fire himself, which led him to pick the Christians as a scapegoat, but that's neither here nor there. This is known due to Tacitus, who was actually alive at the time of the Great Fire, and although he was only 8 years old at the time it happened, during his adult life he utilized the public records and reports which enabled him to write an accurate account. The next 2 common misconceptions I'll be tackling is the narrative that something specific ended the Roman Empire, most commonly either Christianity or barbarians. Now, it is true both of these did play a role in the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but to resume the fall of Rome to a single reason is an oversimplification at best and a gross mistake at worst. There are plenty of reasons why Rome fell, from its destroyed economy to the manpower shortages to the monstrously large borders, and among the many reasons, yes, you have both Christianity and barbarians as a contributing factor, with Christianity being a somewhat minor factor, truth be told, and barbarians being a major factor. That is, if the Roman Empire fell at all. Some people believe, and not without reason, that the Roman Empire only fell in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks. And even then, some people believe the Roman Empire never actually fell. If you want to know more about the fall of Rome, well then, I have quite a few suggestions for you. I've done a video about it if you want to check that out. The sound is kinda bad though. A similarly themed YouTuber named Dominus Maximus has also done a pretty thorough video on the subject. Kings and Generals have done numerous videos on the subject. And finally, once again, I'll have to recommend the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan, episode 179, The End, where he goes over the numerous reasons why the Western Roman Empire fell. The final 2 misconceptions I'll be clearing are regarding Roman culture. The first of these is regarding togas. It is fairly common to describe the Romans as toga-wearing people, and some believe the Romans wore it pretty much all the time. That was true initially. During the days of the early Republic, everybody, men, women and children alike, would wear togas as a durable outerwear. However, as time passed on, the relationship the Romans had with the toga began to deteriorate. As the toga became an increasingly complex piece of clothing, it became pretty much taboo for women to wear them, and eventually even men didn't wear them all the time. The toga actually became a pretty uncomfortable, bulky and impractical piece of clothing, and it was only really utilized in special occasions, like a funeral or religious services. In fact, at a certain point, wearing a toga became so rare. During the 2nd century AD, the poet Juvenal remarked that across many parts of Italy, no man would don the toga until he was dead. The final misconception I'll be clearing is regarding statues. If you were to look at any marble statue built in the Roman period, what's so striking about it is the clear white color of the sculpture. This leads plenty of people to believe that the Romans simply made the coloring of the statue that way. However, the sculptors responsible for these pieces of art did paint the marble statues. In fact, contrary to the popular imagination, ancient Rome was actually a very colorful Las Vegas-esque place, which personally makes the city seem kind of tacky to me. But then again, that's just me. Over time, the paints were washed away, and what we're left with is the clear monochromatic white, which led future generations to believe that the Roman statues had always been devoid of color. And that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this little video. Leave a like, leave your thoughts in the comment section below, perhaps to leave out another misconception I didn't cover about ancient Rome. And if you're not subscribed, don't forget to do just that. I'd appreciate it. This was Spectrum, and I'll see you around.